The title of the book is called Strangers in the Land, and it comes from a Supreme Court decision where upholding one of the Chinese exclusion laws, and the justice referred to the Chinese as strangers in the land in a negative way. But today there are other groups that are strangers, and this book, I think, is really about our diverse democracy and, all kinds of groups and people that have been viewed and are viewed as strangers.
When I was 18 years old, I showed up on Capitol Hill as a congressional intern and started meeting other interns from other places in the country. It was the first time I had ever been around people who used summer as a verb. Most of them came from very wealthy Northeastern sorts of backgrounds. And I found that one guy in particular would introduce me to people and would say, now, he's from Mississippi, but he reads. Or he's from Mississippi, but he's really smart. Or he's an evangelical Christian, but not like that. And I kept thinking to myself at first, do you realize how backhandedly insulting everything you're saying is here to me? And the second thing I thought was, do I really belong here? Am I really out of place? And I'll bet that almost everybody listening to this, you've had something like that in your life where you've wondered, am I really fitting here, or am I kind of a stranger? And that's why I think that the conversation we're going to have today will apply to everybody. You're going to find that you resonate with a lot that our next guest is talking about. My guest today is Michael Luo, who is the author of the new book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. Michael is executive editor at The New Yorker, writes regularly for the magazine. Before that, he was at the New York Times, and before that, at the Associated Press. Michael, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. We've talked over the years, and it's just great to be able to talk about this book with you.
I had a Korean American friend who told me one time that he was kind of almost triggered by the question, "Where are you from?" Because he sensed behind it there was the language of, you're not actually from here. You're not actually from America. You talk about an incident that you had where someone really kind of viciously came at you. Could you tell us about that on the Upper East Side?
Yeah. It's kind of there are multiple moments that led to this book, but this encounter was kind of a seed and kind of set me on this journey. This was October 2016. It was a Sunday after church. I was on the sidewalk with the group of friends, Asian American friends, my family. I was pushing my youngest daughter in a stroller, and we were trying to decide what restaurant to go to for lunch after church. And a woman, well-dressed woman, kind of looked like typical Manhattan Upper East Side woman, brushed past us, aggravated we were in the way, and muttered under her breath when she brushed past us, "Go back to China."
Ooh.
And so this was after church. I did not turn the other cheek. Maybe this was in that moment. I abandoned my daughter in her stroller, and her ran after the woman and kind of confronted her, and we kind of had this exchange on the sidewalk, and she was yelling at me, and she yelled, "Go back to your effing country."
Huh.
And in that moment, I basically just kind of sputtered because you're thinking of what is the comeback, and I was like, I was born in this country. It felt so silly. And I tweeted about this moment. This was Twitter's heyday, and I used this hashtag. This is 2016, and kind of talking about how could this happen, in this year 2016. We're still at this point, and it kind of became this viral thing, and then ended up writing an open letter to this woman. The New York Times published online at first, and then on the front page of the newspaper, and it kind of led to this outpouring. The New York Times asked people to other Asian Americans to send in videos where they kind of talked about their own experiences with this kind of thing. And it just kind of led to this week-long sort of conversation about Asian Americans and race. The thing that I wrote about in this letter was this feeling of otherness that's been part of the Asian American experience. And this was just an encounter on the street, and I've had that kind of thing happen before. It's not like it's not like a incredibly common thing or anything like that. But this moment in particular, the election was a couple of weeks away. Trump would shock the world, and in a couple of weeks, there was. I felt like a kind of a creeping sense of nativism was descending on the country, and there was this thing in the air, and I just felt this kind of sadness, I guess, because I was thinking about my kids. They're two generations they removed from my parents' immigrant experience. My parents came as graduate students in the 1960s, early 70s. And I wondered, they're born in America, don't speak Chinese, and I wondered, will they ever feel like they truly belonged? And so that moment kind of set me. It was a few years still until I started on this project, but that kind of set me on this journey.
You use a phrase in the book, perpetual foreignness, that I found especially evocative of explaining what this is like.
Yeah, I mean that's a long running theme that has afflicted Asian Americans. There's the epigraph to my book is from this book called Interior Chinatown. It's a novel by a guy named Charles Yu. It's an extraordinary book. It won the National Book Award in 2020, and it's this the main character in this book is a background actor on a TV police procedural called Black and White, about a black cop and a white cop, and he is generic Asian man. That's his role on the TV show. And his greatest aspiration in life is to become Kung Fu Man. And it's a critique of the way race is in America is often viewed solely through the lens of black and white. And there's this line in the book where there's kind of an imaginary trial, and the main character is litigating his case, and he asks this question of who gets to be an American. And he kind of also talks about how why it is that Asian Americans kind of keep falling out of the story, even though we've been here in some cases for more than 100 years. And so that is kind of the heart of the book, is who gets to be considered American.
I remember when I was a youth pastor, because in our area, we had a very large Vietnamese American population. And there was one Vietnamese American teenager who was talking about being in civics class or history class. And the teacher was going around the room saying, what do you want to be in your career? And he said, I would like to be president of the United States. And her response was to say, a Vietnamese president of the United States. What do you really want to be? And when he was
Wow.
telling this story, he said, you know, and I mean, I guess she's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I was more struck by his response than I was even
Mm-hmm.
by her racist
Yeah.
comment. And I wonder, how often do you think that's the case, that this sort of psychologically this is internalized, this sense of perpetual foreignness?
Well, so the thing about it is like the that we have to keep in mind when it comes to conversations about race is there are multiple things can be true at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I think it's a impossible task. It's not very helpful to kind of try to evaluate gradations of victimhood or things like that. And I think the 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 line between kind of this kind of sense of disconnection, alienation, this otherness, and kind of structural factors, um, that hold back a minority group is a complicated line to figure out. That the reality is, Asian Americans, many Asian Americans have come post 1965, the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which set aside this quota system that had governed our immigration for a long time. And up to that point, very few Chinese immigrants, very few Asian immigrants were allowed into the country. And the 1965 law changed all that and led to this demographic transformation that we're experiencing today. That law prioritized people with particular skills, talents, and that's partly how my parents. My dad was a PhD in engineering, went to Northwestern. My mom was an accountant and got her master's degree at a school in Illinois in accounting, and so there is, and that's led to this kind of this model minority sort of myth, this idea that the Asian Americans who are here are educated and privileged and that kind of thing. But that masks this the reality of Asian Americans have the greatest income inequality of any ethnic group, and it masks the sort of the variation in experiences of different Asian groups. It's such a broad tent. And so, in terms of like how persistent this is, how often this is, the thing that I came away with from immersing myself in this history in the archives is that the precarity of the Asian American experience, the Asian experience in America, is consistent through history. We've been told to go back to where we come from, going back to the middle of the 19th century, and that's something that's important to keep in mind. It might not always be there, and it comes out in certain moments in the COVID-19 pandemic when there was the surge in violence towards Asian Americans. It came out then. That was a moment of a lot of uncertainty. There were economic things going on. There was obviously blame of where the origins of this virus came from. There was a president who talked about the China virus and Kung flu, and so and so it came out then. And so and this is the way history works. History doesn't repeat itself necessarily, but it rhymes, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
You mentioned COVID. I can also think about World War II, when the country's at war with Japan, and even just looking back at cartoons from that era. The really racist depiction of all Asian people there in those cartoons and so forth. Do you think that in moments like that, COVID, World War II, so forth, that there's a spike in this sort of reality, or is it just a pulling back and an unveiling of what's consistently there?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, in some ways, what you're talking about is one and the same. I guess what I think. Here's what I think. I think just human nature wise, it's difficult for us to. Difference is difficult for us. So I covered religion a long time, and I remember when I was a national writer for the Associated Press, I wrote a story about Asian American churches that were trying to become multi-ethnic.
Mm-hmm.
So there were, Asian Americans started out in ethnic specific churches. They spoke a specific language, Korean, Chinese. Um, and then there's a second generation, and so usually it starts out as an English ministry, and then there was a kind of a maturation of kind of these Asian American churches that are started by Asian Americans, and they wanted to be multi-ethnic, diverse. They want to have white congregants, black congregants, Latino congregants, and it was very hard. No one has really. When I reported this story, I don't have the latest, but this is a couple decades ago, and I was just kind of reporting on the experience of this, and one of the things I concluded from that is difference is hard. Like when you are in a small group with somebody else, it's easier if they're like you. If you have an educational background like you, ethnic background like you, class background like you, and so I think in general, it's important to keep in mind that this takes intentionality. It takes work. What's behind bigotry and violence towards Asian Americans, and in the history that I look at in the 19th century and the early 20th century. Is it economics? Is it race? Is it religion? It's actually all of these things. There was when the violence kind of really started to peak in the 1870s, 1880s, and they passed what's known today as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a law that barred Chinese laborers from entering the country. There was an economic depression going on in the 1870s that kind of really blanketed the country and closed factories, closed shops, and there was legions of white laborers who were struggling in San Francisco, in the West Coast, all over the country. But the scapegoat in it was this influx of Chinese immigrants, and so economics was definitely part of it. But religion was part of it. They called the Chinese heathens. And race was definitely part of it too. And so, it's all of these factors that, lead to these kinds of, whether it's a spike or a revealing, as you say.
Do you think the religious motivation, if you go back to the 19th century, does it seem to you to be more of a motivating factor or more of a justifying factor, kind of a way to give a spiritual justification for bigotry?
Yeah. So, well, this is fascinating. The book, my book has a lot of Christians in it, which is really interesting. It's because a lot of churches sent missionaries to the West Coast, the Pacific Coast, as it was called back then, to reach the Chinese. And some of these pastors were real champions for the Chinese and stood up for them in the face of bigotry and violence, even as they sometimes perpetuated some of these things. The way you would read of sometimes some of these leaders or these pastors or these missionaries would refer to the character of the Chinese because they were heathens is pretty ugly, even at the same time as you really admire the courage that it took for some of these pastors to stand up for the Chinese. The other reason that there's a lot of Christians in the book is uh, archives of the Chinese are rare. There's nothing. There's a guy, Gordon Chang, who's a professor at Stanford, who did this big transnational project on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Chinese were a big part of the construction of the railroad, and he looked in China and in the United States for Chinese language archives, and it just didn't exist. And it's not really clear how or why. It could be because a lot of Chinatowns were burned down in the 1880s. In China, it could be because the Cultural Revolution, anything associated with the West, might have destroyed it. A lot of the archives that remain that have voices of Chinese were ones that they could speak English. And why could they speak English? They were they went to English language classes taught by churches. In some cases, they converted and became pastors and became missionaries here in New York. And so it's a fascinating thing. So it is when you talk about this was a period in the West when you talk about manifest destiny. So manifest destiny was this kind of belief that it was this kind of God led, God inspired sort of destiny for the United States to kind of go from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that was rooted in a spiritual sort of belief, a spiritual inspiration, and that also had elements of white supremacy really in it, and manifest destiny and some of these things that happen in the West, were really ugly. Led to horrific violence against indigenous peoples, and as well as the Chinese, and so it's kind of both, and that's what history is. It's not it's not one or the other. It's complicated.
With the Chinese Exclusion Act and some of the other things that you talk about early on in the book, there was a sense of competition with immigrants into the community, but there really wasn't against the countries themselves, the originating countries themselves. How do you think things might play out with the tariff wars and the trade wars that we have really accelerating now? Potentially, I mean, we could envision over the next several years China achieving dominance with artificial intelligence, maybe an invasion of Taiwan. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities that are out there. Is the country in a better place to learn how to translate those sorts of tensions toward their own neighbors and their own fellow Americans than we have been in the past?
Wow. Well, so that's a really good point. The thing about it is, during this period of Chinese migration to the United States in the 19th century, China was very weak. It was the end of the Qing dynasty, and it was a mess. Today, China is a juggernaut, military, economically, technologically. And the thing that's frightening to me is both parties right now, it's kind of in vogue to bash China and be really bellicose about China. And, this is interesting because my parents were born in mainland China, went to Taiwan when the communists came. My dad's dad was a general in the KMT, the Kuomintang, and was killed, or he disappeared in one of the last battles between the communists and the nationalists. And so my parents have view China, communist China, with a degree of wariness and suspicion, and they go back to Taiwan, and there's obviously the threat there is looms larger and larger. And when I talk to them about so now there have been all these states who have passed laws like targeting Chinese nationals, barring Chinese national from land ownership and things like that. And the rationale behind it is ostensibly national security. There's economic sort of concerns there. And when I talk to my parents, there's actually a degree of openness to that sort of thing, interestingly, like because they're like, oh, this is like, because like they're worried about communist China. The thing that I worry about is all of this language just adds to this tinder of racial suspicion. And I think that as this trade war ratchets upwards, and as this kind of the tensions between the China and the U.S. rise, like that's another moment when the precarity for Asian Americans is going to be exposed.
I think one thing that's almost universal is the fact that most of us, there comes a point in our lives when we look back and say, oh, I think I understand my parents better than I ever did before. I can see them as human beings now in a way that they loomed so large in childhood, and you think they've got a manual as to what to do, and there comes a point where you realize, I can see what was happening there. What did you learn about your parents' experience as you were working on this book that you might not have known before?
So, to be clear, my parents, this history of people who came in the gold rush and in the 19th century, this kind of there are Chinese in the United States who have been here for 5 generations. It's incredible. You see a lot of them in San Francisco, elsewhere on the West Coast. Sometimes in New York, in New York's Chinatown. My parents came, in the 1960s, so that's not my history. But my publisher really wanted to be able to have this book bring us up to the present moment. And so the book kind of ends in this 1960s Immigration and Nationality Act. And I bring in my parents, and my personal story are in the introduction and the epilogue. And so I interviewed my parents as, for this epilogue, and I wanted to kind of understand their story. It's funny. It's like when you talk about your relationship with your parents. They didn't, when they came, I asked them like was it a complicated decision was it scary? Was to make this decision when you were in college to venture, across the ocean to this, strange land where you only spoke the language, in a very, broken sort of way. And they to be honest, they maybe this is kind of Asian reticence. They kind of didn't make it to be like a big thing. Taiwan at that point was not the economic dragon that it eventually became. It was actually really still kind of backward and developing, and the opportunities were in the U.S. and many of their classmates, maybe most of their classmates, were coming to the United States for graduate school, and so they went too. The thing about it is like I think a lot of the first generation folks who are here, they're kind of just busy surviving and trying to figure out this place and raising their families and living. And it's often the second generation, my generation, that's processing and trying to make sense of it.
Now, you're a Christian. Is that an awkward thing to talk about, given your vocation at the New Yorker, New York Times, Associated Press, the places you've been in your life?
I would say yes and no. Um, so, all of us resist being labeled.
Mm-hmm.
I think you alluded to this a little bit at the top. Yeah, I go to church, but, I'm not like that or whatever. And everybody's story and background and approach to their faith is different. And so you don't, so you got to, so you resist the labels and the stereotypes. I the it's true that and I think it's gotten worse. Over the course of, I graduated college in 1998, and have been in this business now for a few decades. And the uh, what maybe progressive, sort of secular, sort of, I guess maybe sort of, you might call it the cosmopolitan elites is a term that some sociologists have used to describe this. Have view the church. I think it's on a downward slope.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, what I would say is it's it's not anything new that newsrooms value diversity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I was at the New York Times. I came to the New York Times in 2004, and it was after this scandal, the Jason Blair scandal. There's a
Oh
reporter
yeah.
that they caught making up stories, and it led to a report, a kind of a commission that was put together about improving the credibility of the New York Times. So this was like, I think like 2005, like mid 2000s, and one of one of the things they talked about in that report was, how important it was for the Times to have diversity in all its forms, including people who are in the military, people who go to church, you know, and so the stories that we cover, um, it helps to have people from all different walks of life, and it leads to interesting story ideas. And so one of my first stories when I was a cub reporter at the LA Times was about the future of the megachurch in America. This was in suburban Orange County, and I wrote about the future of Saddleback, and because it ran on the front page of the LA Times. And like when I every journalist, every writer brings themselves to the table, and so I have particular interests, and so I'm an Asian American. I've written about Asian American history. I go to church. I've been really interested in how the American church has evolved and ended up the way it is today. And I love history, and I've written about that church history. And so, my current boss is David Remnick at the New Yorker,
Mm-hmm.
and he values that. And so that's why I say yes and no. It's no doubt, just like in any kind of secular, urban, sort of cosmopolitan sort of setting, there's a skepticism, suspicion for people of faith, not just Christians of all kinds of faith. But it's also viewed as an asset. And the last thing I'll say is, it might surprise you, but there are more of people of faith than you would imagine, as common stereotype, at these places.
Doesn't surprise me at all, because one of the things that I notice as somebody who's in a quote unquote secular media ecosystem a lot is how many people whisper, I'm a Christian, or I go to church. And there are a lot of folks there. One of the heroines of my church background was a woman by the name of Lottie Moon, who was a Virginian who became a missionary to China, lived her whole life and died there. It's kind of a revered figure. But when one talks about that missions movement to Asia, it's complicated because on the one hand, one could see a church realizing, okay, we actually have people on the ground in China. We ought to see our Chinese neighbors as created in the image of God. Mm-hmm. You also can see, some would say, a kind of colonizing sort of impulse behind a lot of the missions movements. Which is more accurate in your view?
Oh man, you're asking to venture very far out at this point. I mean, I think. I mean, I think it's both things are true. You know, and I think actually the church properly has wrestled with that, and it's something that definitely needs to. I mean, that's the thing is like you can't turn away from it. You can't sugarcoat it. You can't idealize it. I think you need to confront it. Like these, like there's a guy in the book, a guy named Otis Gibson, who was a Methodist minister in San Francisco, a heroic figure in defending the Chinese, and he became a big figure in just kind of part of a movement of people that were kind of obsessed with the evils of Chinese prostitution. A lot of women who were coming, but not all, were slaves, like sexual slaves. And there was a big trade, a sex trade in San Francisco. There were plenty of European immigrants and, white Americans who are prostitutes too, but the Chinese and Chinese women became a scourge. And in the path to Chinese exclusion, there was a law passed in 1875 called the Page Act that targeted Chinese women and prostitution in particularly. And Gibson became this big advocate fighting this trade and just participated in the worst kind of stereotyping. He was saying that you could tell. So, like, how do you tell the difference between a virtuous Chinese woman and a prostitute? And he said it was, you could tell by like what they wear, and like if there was this scene in the book where there was a trial, and they were trying to deport this group of Chinese women, and Gibson was insisting that I have proof, and he was lifting their their dresses to show that underneath were these colorful garb, and so this was proof, and it was just absurd. And so that's like does that diminish what Otis Gibson was for the Methodist Church? I think it's just important to face all of that, head on. And, that's the thing is the church is made up of humans.
You talk about in the book at one point, invisibility. And I think about a lot of the people, especially early on in the 19th century that you're talking about, people whose names, I mean, those who built the railroad system, for instance, whose names are kind of lost to history. There have been efforts I can think of, for instance, some of the exhibits at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum for those who were victims of lynching. Mm-hmm. And you can see similar sorts of movements to take people who might be made invisible and to make their stories visible. Do you see any sort of movement to do that in this context?
Yeah, actually, the anti-Asian violence, when that moment, 2020, 2021, the surge in reports and violence against Asians, actually led to a bunch of different places that experienced this history, groups to form and kind of efforts kind of blossom to memorialize some of these moments, and also a couple of cities actually apologize for their treatment of the Chinese, a couple of cities on the West Coast. And so there actually are, so in 1871, there was this horrific massacre. I think it could be the worst mass lynching in American history is actually not of Black Americans, but of Chinese in Los Angeles. I think it was like 18, 19 people were lynched in 1871. Right now, there's just a tiny plaque that marks it. And there's an effort now to build a big memorial for it, and so they're now a few years away. There's a design that was picked. I wrote one of my chapters is about Rock Springs. There's this horrific massacre in 1885 where white miners, coal miners, slaughtered. I think it was 28 Chinese miners and burned down the Chinese Quarter. And there is something that marks this in Rock Springs right now. But this summer they're going to unveil this larger memorial to mark it. And another town that comes to mind is Eureka, California, which in 1885 drove out the Chinese, and like about 300 Chinese it was kind of the opening act of this period that they call, historians call the driving out, when dozens of communities in the West drove out the Chinese. And in Eureka now there's an effort to kind of, again, build a memorial and remember this. And so it's happening there. It's interesting that this kind of awakening that happened around the anti-Asian violence, it was a kind of I guess I see it as a little bit of a blip. It was kind of this moment where Asian Americans and all Americans really were very conscious of this. I'm not 100% sure if anything concrete is going to lasting that will come of this. One lasting thing is, I hope, will be this book. I mean, this book, I set out to, I started working on it in the spring of 2021, soon after the Atlanta spa attacks, where a group of women, mostly Korean immigrants, were killed by a white shooter. And it was just such a, horrific and galvanizing sort of moment. And a couple months, I wrote a piece for the New Yorker that about this history, and a couple months later, I had signed this contract to write this book, and here we are, more than 3 years later, and it's coming out on April 29th.
You talk about the blip. Right now, we seem to be in a moment of backlash against what seemed to be kind of an awakening happening toward racial justice and toward combating anti-Asian violence and dealing with sexual assault and sexual abuse and all of those kinds of things. Seems to be a backlash to that right now in American culture. Companies getting rid of their DEI programs that they had, and even language of DEI being applied to minority people who are in any number of positions. Do you think that backlash is a blip, or does this really portend something permanent, relatively speaking, in American life?
Well, I hope not. I hope it's not permanent. I guess I view things. I think there are cycles of history. I see so many parallels to the current moment, to what happened in the 19th century to Chinese immigrants. It was this kind of period of economic uncertainty that led to it was an opening for kind of populist demagogue figures. There was a guy in San Francisco named Dennis Carney who uh, uh, led these giant rallies with hundreds, thousands of people on the sandlots of in San Francisco, and he would end his rallies with this rallying cry, "The Chinese must go," and his the ideology of his movement was kind of railing against kind of corporate power, but also scapegoating Chinese. And there's this kind of movement. It wasn't just white laborers; it was small business owners. It was even in some cases community leaders, and there was a misplaced anger towards immigrants. Like there have actually been some interesting studies done to more recently by economists who are trying to pinpoint the economic effects of Chinese exclusion, and have found that actually white workers didn't economically benefit from Chinese exclusion, and a lot of these communities experience economic downturns because after exclusion. They lost some of the synergies that happened with Chinese workers and white workers in some of these factories, and there's also they also discovered that Chinese workers and white workers were actually not quite in the same labor pool. They were not competing exactly for the same jobs, and I see a lot of that happening today. The title of the book is called "Strangers in the Land," and it comes from a Supreme Court decision where upholding one of the Chinese exclusion laws, and the justice referred to the Chinese as strangers in the land in a negative way, but today there are other groups that are strangers, and this book, I think, is really about our diverse democracy, and all kinds of groups and people that have been viewed and are viewed as strangers.
One last thing. You mentioned writing one of your early articles about the future of the megachurch. And after the death of Tim Keller, you wrote an analysis of his life in the New Yorker. What was unique about Keller?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that. Tim. So I got to know Tim in the mid to late 2000s when I wrote a story for the New York Times about him overcoming his great suspicion of mainstream media, and we became friends. He was actually a great fan of me and this book. At the end of his life, he would ask me about how I was doing. He was really excited about it. It's really sad to me that he didn't live long enough to see it published. I've written to his wife Kathy to let her know that this book is coming out. Tim was just a I remember interviewing him at his apartment in Roosevelt Island, and it's just full of books.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. There are a lot of people who imitate Tim, but you can't quite. You can't imitate him if you haven't been steeped for years and years, as he was, as a reader, a voracious reader of everything, fiction, philosophy, science, and he was just a great observer of cultural currents and of church history. Like whenever I would be working on a story about the church or church history, I would call him and we would discuss it. We didn't necessarily agree on everything, he was just a great intellect, but also, and this is a little bit lesser known about him, a great pastoral presence. Just a friend. And so I just appreciate that.
Michael Luo, author of Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. Thanks, Michael, for being with us today.
Thank you.